Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm John Alger, president of James Madison University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you for what we expect will be an enlightening and educational program. James Madison University is co-sponsoring this program in conjunction with our Madison Vision series, which features prominent speakers on important public issues of our time. This program represents a collaboration across higher education in Virginia. We have partnered with Norfolk State University to organize this event, and I want to thank our Norfolk State colleagues and their president, Dr. Javon Adams-Gaston, who will also be speaking in tonight's program. We welcome friends from colleges and universities across the Commonwealth and will continue to work collaboratively on programs related to civic engagement and the role of higher education in supporting and sustaining democracy in the months and years to come. Tonight, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the rewriting of the Commonwealth of Virginia Constitution. This program is part of a year-long celebration by the Virginia Constitution 50th Anniversary Task Force. Across the state, over the next 9 months, scholars, students, and citizens will engage in meaningful discussions around the history of this document. The discussion will begin with a look back at the ways that the Virginia Constitution has shaped the Commonwealth and impacted the lives of Virginians. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Justice Elizabeth McClanahan, President and Dean of the Appalachian School of Law. Justice McClanahan served as a member of the Virginia Supreme Court for 8 years and Court of Appeals for 8 years before assuming the deanship at ASL. This summer, Justice McClanahan will become the new CEO of the Virginia Tech Foundation. So congratulations, Justice McClanahan. Justice McClanahan holds an undergraduate degree from William & Mary and a JD from the University of Dayton. McClanahan has received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Dayton School of Law and was named one of Virginia Lawyers Media Influential Women of Virginia. Justice McClanahan will launch tonight's event by moderating a discussion with A.E. Dick Howard, Warner Booker Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. Professor Howard is not only an expert on the Virginia Constitution, but he was truly in the room where it happened in 1971 as the Constitution was rewritten. And yes, those of you that are Hamilton fans, you're probably singing right now in your minds. Professor Howard served as the executive director of the commission charged with rewriting the Constitution, directed the successful referendum campaign for the Constitution's adoption, and is the preeminent expert on the history of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Professor Howard has twice been a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He has served as president of the Virginia Academy of Laureates and has received the University of Virginia's Distinguished Professor Award for Excellence in Teaching. James Madison University, the University of Richmond, Campbell University, William & Mary, and Wake Forest University have all conferred upon him the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws. In fall 2001, he was the first distinguished visiting scholar in residence at Rhodes House, Oxford. So following the initial dialogue with Professor Howard, Dr. Adams-Gaston and I will join to lead a question and answer period exploring the future of the Commonwealth and the further impact of the 1971 Constitution. We will then turn things over to students from JMU and NSU to explore questions directed toward Professor Howard submitted by audience members. While some questions were presented in advance, we also encourage those of you joining us in the live stream to submit your questions there as well. Dr. Adams-Gaston will then end the program with some concluding remarks. I will now hand things over to Justice McClanahan to moderate the discussion.
Thank you so much, President Alger. Appalachian School of Law is honored to be able to join Norfolk State and James Madison in this important moment with Professor Howard. And Professor Howard, what an incredible honor for us to celebrate this anniversary with you. So much has happened in the last half century of our Commonwealth's history. So if you would, take us back in time to 1971, remind us of how you ended up in the room where it happened, so to speak. You're muted, Professor Howard.
Okay, thank you. There we go. That's a fault on my part, but thank you to James Madison University, to Norfolk State University, to Appalachian School of Law, to the others who've made this program possible, because it has been 50 years since the effective date of the 1971 Constitution, and it's worth thinking about how it got started. It began in 1968, and the obvious question, which you've just asked, is, why? Why was this revision undertaken? Well, the passage of time alone might have justified the revision. The previous Constitution had been adopted in 1902, so it had been over half a century. But that's by no means the whole story. What the story is really about, I think, is that that earlier Constitution, the 1902 document, was steeped in racism and white supremacy. If you read the debates of that particular convention of 1901, 1902, they are perhaps not surprising, but they're, to modern sensibilities, they're shocking. The delegates of that convention were very upfront about what they wanted. They wanted to get Black voters off the rolls of Virginia. They wanted to re-establish white supremacy. They were particularly angry at the reconstruction of the 1870 Constitution, the one that was adopted right after the Civil War, because that obviously brought African Americans into the mainstream of Virginia politics, and the delegates in 1901, 1902 wanted to put a stop to that. They wanted to end that. So they brought with them a sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, that history and God's will, theology and history together, decreed that white people should be in command and Black people ought to understand their place. The delegates couldn't roll the clock all the way back and reinstitute slavery, obviously, but they were going to go as far back as they could. And they were grimly effective in what they did. They put the poll tax in place. They had complicated registration requirements. They had any number of ways of being sure that no matter how qualified a Black citizen was, he would not be allowed to vote. So after the 1902 Constitution was put in place, the percentage of Blacks who were in fact able to vote plunged to about 5%. It also, by the way, it disenfranchised a lot of poor whites who couldn't pay the poll tax. So it set things up the next several days, months and years of Virginia history, where the era of the so-called bird machine. Fast forward then to the 50s and 60s, this was the immediate context of the 1968 revision. Brown versus Board had decreed that there could not be segregation in public schools. The era of the 1960s, those who remembered or have read about it will recall what a shocking and in many ways awful decade it was. Assassinations of JFK, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. But beyond that, there were initiatives coming out of Washington which really changed the landscape. The Supreme Court decreed one person, one vote in state and federal legislative chambers. The Supreme Court has struck down Virginia's poll tax. And Congress, of course, had passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So the landscape was fundamentally different. All these things, I think, brought together the need to rewrite the existing Virginia Constitution.
And so how did the Commission on Constitutional Revision actually come into being? And can you tell us who were the members?
Well, one of the ironies of that commission's appointment was that Governor Mills Godwin, who at one point had been a firm supporter of segregation and of massive resistance, by the time he was governor, some change of heart, if you like, but at any rate, he was the one who proposed to the General Assembly that they authorized the appointment of a Commission on Constitutional Revision. And he was interested, I think, spurred by the need to enlarge Virginia's borrowing capacity to issue bonds for such things as community colleges. But he made it clear in his address to the Assembly that the commission, once appointed, would have no boundaries to its charge. They could undertake a general overhaul. And he appointed to the commission an amazing group of people. This is back in the age, I suppose, when one recognized the sort of natural leadership of the Commonwealth. So you had people on the commission like Lewis Powell, who later sat on the U.S. Supreme Court, Hardy Dillard, who after that, this became a justice of the World Court at The Hague, Colgate Darden, who'd been a UVA president, former governor of Virginia, Oliver Hill, who was the Thurgood Marshall of Virginia. He was Virginia's leading civil rights attorney involved in the desegregation cases and so forth. Just an amazing group of people. And it was both biracial and bipartisan. I would notice there were no women on the commission. That was maybe a little bit too early for that. The women's rights movement really got going big time in the 1970s. But other than that obvious omission, it was biracial, bipartisan, and just a wonderful group of men who, across boundaries of race and party, were able to work together for the common good in Virginia.
And so can you tell us how that commission proceeded with its work and what some of the commission's principal recommendations were at the time?
Absolutely. Well, they asked me if I would sign on as executive director. I frankly was excited at the opportunity to work with people of that quality. I didn't tell them at the time I had not read the old Constitution all the way through, so I wasn't sure I knew my way around. But I was a young law professor, you know, young professors can do anything, so I signed on. Now these were people.
Well, may I interrupt you on that point, because I do want you to tell us all how old you were, because I know that, and you were incredibly young to be doing this job, but I think it will inspire our students who are listening about what you can achieve at such a young age, although they may see it as an old age, but we all see it as a young age.
I was 34 at the time, and that was the era when teenagers were taught not to trust anybody over 35. So I just barely made it on this side of respect, but by the standards of my students, I expect I was already in the middle age. And I just started teaching, and as I say, I had not read the existing Virginia Constitution. I didn't tell the commissioners that would have been embarrassed, but I read about it, went back into its history. Now the commissioners worked, they were all very busy people. These were part-time weekend sort of charges. So they would come to town every few weeks and put in a long weekend, and I would put in all-nighters trying to pull together what they decided to do. They did have council for we divided the commission into 5 subcommittees, 2 members per subcommittee, each had a council, and my job was to sort of lay issues on the table. I was not the decision maker. They made the policies, but I tried to help them think about what needed to be done, what sort of approaches they might take, and also be sure that all the different parts fit together. As far as recommendations went, they actually rose to the occasion. I was pleasantly not surprised so much, but I was pleased that they understood some of the things that needed to be done. First, a general overhaul. The old Constitution, aside from the racism, was just an antiquated document. It had a lot of material that was in effect statutory, a lot things that belonged in the code. So they reorganized the document, they cut it in half. The 1971 Constitution is about half the length of the one that it replaced. I think the most important substantive changes were in the area of education. Remember, this was right on the heels of Brown versus Board and massive resistance. So they put education in the Bill of Rights. They drew language from Thomas Jefferson's Bill for the More General Diffusion of Knowledge, put it in as a fundamental right along there with free speech and free exercise of religion. Then in Article 8, which is the education article, they began with a mandate to the General Assembly to have public schools for every child of school age throughout Virginia. In other words, no more massive resistance, and a mandate to cities and counties to put up their share of the money once the appropriation bill came into being. So no more Prince Edward counties. It was you could bring a mandate. The Attorney General could bring mandamus against a locality that did not do its share. Then the Assembly, the Commission, put into place in Article 8 so-called standards of quality. This was a new idea. It wasn't in the old Constitution, and this gave place of primacy to the Board of Education in laying out standards, which would then be reviewed. The final word would go to the General Assembly, and the purpose was to nudge Virginia in the direction of better and better schools for its children. There were a number of other changes. I won't go into them all, but there was a new environmental article. There'd never been one in the old Constitution. There was an anti-discrimination clause that was new. There'd not been one before. So in many ways, it was a progressive document, hardly radical, because the men on the commission were by no means radicals, but they took positive steps in the direction of trying to create a constitution responsive to the needs of modern Virginia.
And were all these commission members volunteers? I mean, were they doing this as a matter of public service at the time?
They were indeed. There was no, I mean, I suppose they got some mileage for the travel to and from Charlottesville where we met, but this was not a salaried position. It was definitely pro bono publico in the best sense of the word.
Right. So what action did the General Assembly actually take on the committee's recommendations?
Well, having served as executive director, I was then asked to be counsel to the General Assembly during the special session when they received and reviewed the commission's proposals. And I frankly went down to Richmond with a fairly heavy heart because I thought the special interest would go to work and the lobbyists and all that, and they would sort of dismantle the Constitution and make it kind of a Christmas tree. I was there pleasantly surprised that the legislators rose to the occasion as the commission had done, and they were very serious about their work. There was bipartisanship, and it's hard to imagine a totally bipartisan process given the climate we live in today, but the legislators did their job very well. So I would say that once they had finished and had the Constitution ready to present to the voters, it was maybe by and large better than the version that the commission had given them.
And can you tell us what the referendum campaign was like, how it was organized, and whether there was any opposition?
You know, by this point, Governor Linwood Holton was in office, the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. He asked me if I'd run the referendum campaign. Well, the drafting part was, you know, I was a law professor. That was not too strange to me, but I'd never done anything in politics. I know anything about organizing campaigns, but I wanted to see the thing through, so I agreed to do it. I took leave of absence from the law school. We raised private money. There was no state appropriation, whatever. It was entirely private funds. And I decided I would do what I needed to do if I were helping organize a campaign for governor or senator. So we had a speakers bureau. We had local committees in the counties and cities throughout the state. We had all the paraphernalia of a campaign, you know, bumper stickers and billboards and TV ads and all the rest. And I got on the road and went all over Virginia, from Big Stone Gap in the one end to Anancock in the other, talking to any groups, Black churches and union halls and Republican suburban women's clubs, and, you know, you name it, I was willing to talk about the Constitution. And I must say, it was a wonderful experience for me. I saw places I'd never seen and met all sorts of folks. And my job, as I saw it, the campaign was organized around the assumption that lack of information about the proposed Constitution would be deadly. If people didn't really understand what they were being asked to vote on, they would vote no. And we figured 30% of people would probably vote no, regardless of what you said. On top of that, there was misinformation. I encountered for the first time conspiracy theories, because there were people who put it out that this new Constitution surely wasn't written in Virginia. Virginians wouldn't write a document like this. It had to have been written in, I don't know, Beijing or Moscow, or worse yet, maybe New York or Chicago. But Virginia, well, this is Lewis Powell and Colgate Darden and all that crowd. You don't get any more Virginian than that. But say the conspiracy theorists were there. In Southside Virginia, the word was out that the new Constitution would result in school busing. And busing was a big issue in the early 70s in Virginia. But somehow we got past that. The newspaper editorial pages weighed in. We had the support, endorsement of all 5 statewide associations of local constitutional officers, groups like the Chamber of Commerce and unions and the Crusade for Voters, and lots of other people weighed in and came down in favor of the new Constitution. So it worked out. We got 72% of the vote. if you were running for office, that would be a mandate. You'd love to have percentages. We ran it up to 85% in some counties and cities. It began to look like a Bulgarian plebiscite or something. It was almost unbelievable. But what really pleased me, not only to get it adopted, but to use that process of the campaign to get people to think about the Constitution. It was in effect an exercise in civic education.
I'm just a little surprised that you haven't run for governor with numbers like that and with the knowledge of the geography of Virginia that is so expansive. Not too many people have been from one end of the West to the other end of the East. So those of us in the Great Southwest appreciate that.
Justice, I'll be interested if you're willing to chair my finance committee and go and raise money for me.
Well, it sounds like you're certainly qualified.
Well, I have to say, I mean, I admire my friends in politics, but I do like the academic life. It suits me much better. It's more calming than politics.
Right. Well, and how much do you remember what that campaign cost? It would be interesting to compare that to current day political campaigns as well. This would be a statewide campaign. How do you remember how much money was raised to do that?
Campaign, and as I say, including TV advertising, bumper stickers, and lapel pins, and all the things you expect. And we spent about $100,000.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, can you imagine spending, I don't know what it would cost today. I hate to think about it. Millions and millions of dollars, no doubt. But I think we got our money's worth. I certainly did.
Well, I was going to say, I would be your finance chair if I only needed to raise $100,000 for a gubernatorial statewide campaign.
You and I wouldn't get very far.
All right. Well, what was the immediate impact of the new Constitution once it was passed?
Well, that's interesting. I know we'll talk in a few minutes about where we are today, 50 years later, but the immediate impact was, I think, most pronounced in the area of education. And that was the centerpiece, really, of the constitutional revision, because under the mandate of Article 8 of the present Constitution, the General Assembly had to go to work on fashioning standards of quality since they had not existed before. And I think that had a lot of impact. I really think, I mean, today you can argue quite rightly that this education has a long way to go. There are problems of equity and the like, but the 1970s saw a kind of jump start because of the Constitution. And I think the immediate impact in good part was subtle, namely that we had put behind us the 1902 Constitution. People understood that their fundamental law, the Constitution of Virginia, was no longer steeped in the racism of the early 20th century, that you could hold up the Constitution with some respect and begin to move forward. And I think it's taken some time, of course, for that to play itself out, but it was an important start.
Well, Professor Howard, I have to say I could spend the whole evening and ask you another 100 more questions, but I think that's all the time we have for this particular segment. We thank you so much for sharing the history, and we look forward to you answering all the questions of the presidents and students. So I'm going to pass the baton off to President Alger and President Adams-Gaston. Dr. Adams-Gaston, we welcome you. She is the 7th president of Norfolk State University and is truly a titan in the world of higher education. So we thank you both for sharing this virtual stage with us this evening, and I'm going to hand the program over to you for the time being.
Thank you, Justice McClanahan. And it has been fascinating to hear, Professor Howard, your responses regarding the 50 years ago and to the present about the Constitution and the Commonwealth. I have a question. Has the 1971 Constitution stood the test of time? That is, have the hopes and the expectations of the revisers been realized?
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful place to start, because I'm sad to say that none of the members of the commission are still with us 50 years later. So I guess that means that I can say anything I like about it, and they're not going to come back to say, no, it didn't happen that way. That's not the way at all. But I got to know them very well. I came away with so much respect for those people. I had known Lewis Powell. He and I were both from Richmond, but I had met Colgate Darden. Most of them, and Oliver Hill I was acquainted with, but most of them I hadn't met. At any rate, I say I had enormous respect. I'd like to think that part of my job as their executive director was to try to get on their wavelength and understand what their hopes and expectations were. And I think if they were around to be asked the question you've just put, I think they would be fairly well pleased. I think that my answer is yes, the Constitution has stood up pretty well. Despite the obvious changes, Virginia in so many ways is a very different place from what it was in 1971. I mean, we've had turbulent politics, we've had urbanization, we've had the infusion of the overlay of national politics over Virginia politics in a way that was simply not true 50 years ago. I mean, one could go on and on. Not that we've changed entirely, but obviously it's a different age. I think the Constitution has served well as a fundamental piece of architecture in the state's political scene. And I say that with a sense, we'll get into this later on, I'm sure, but the Constitution actually sketches out fundamentals. It's kind of a framework, as you like. It can't answer all the people, their representatives, the political process has to do so much, but it needs to be built on a solid foundation. I think the Constitution has by and large done that. I think it's actually enabled genuinely representative government in Virginia, so that the government of Virginia is more nearly in the hands of the people of Virginia than it ever was back in the days of the bird machine under the old Constitution. And so I think now, mind you, I think there's some ways in which it hasn't worked out entirely to one's hopes and expectations. I mentioned education as a centerpiece. My impression is that the role of the Board of Education may have seen some erosion compared to the Assembly in terms of what the original Article 8 plan of attack was. I think there may have been some erosion there. The environmental Article 11 of the Constitution, has frankly not really been given teeth by the courts. They've been unwilling to really enforce it the way I think it ought to be. So yes, there's probably some disappointments, but by and large, I think if you take the larger picture, the Constitution stood up pretty well.
And Professor Howard, following up on that, I know when you're writing a constitution, and I know you've got a lot of experience, not just with Virginia, but helping other countries do this. Do you think there have been any developments which the revisers simply did not anticipate, as they were thinking about the future?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. And I think my response is that there's some areas in which, since I was there, I mean, maybe I'm too close to it because I know what those people were thinking. I know, I kind of know the insides of the Constitution, but mind you, the last word comes from the courts. And judges, if I go before the Supreme Court of Virginia and say, Your Honor, here's what I think the revisors were about, they may listen with respect, but the judges get the final word. They decide what the Constitution of Virginia means. And I'll give you one or two examples. I think restoring the voting rights of felons, as you may recall that in the case of Howell versus McAuliffe, there was the question of whether the governor could restore the voting rights of former felons one at a time, or could he, as he claimed, be able to do it for a class of people. It's a technical case. I can't go into all that tonight, but my view was that the governor had the power to do that which he said he wanted to do. If you read the text of the Constitution, it's plain enough to me. But it turned out the court, with all respect to the justices, decided differently. They said, no, he's got to do it one person at a time. I don't think the framers of the present Constitution would have understood that reasoning. And I think, frankly, if you look at the Voting Rights Article 2 of the Constitution, we have in place, in constitutional terms, one of the strictest provisions on the voting rights of former felons of any state in the country. I'm embarrassed to say that. I wish the framers had the vision and foresight to loosen that up and make it easier to restore former felons to full citizenship so they can be part of the body politic as they should be. But I think 50 years ago, perhaps the framers didn't realize how important this was going to come to be over a period of time. So I think maybe they thought the language was enough, that the governor had the power, they thought he had sufficient power. I think another example would be partisan gerrymandering. We added to the Constitution, I suggested to them that they borrow language from a former federal statute that required that districts be compact and contiguous. That language is now in the Virginia Constitution. Now that's not self-revealing. I mean, that's not, doesn't tell you mathematical precision, but it's a mandate. It's a mandate to the General Assembly. And again, the Supreme Court of Virginia understandably doesn't like to second guess the legislature on things like reapportionment. This is Felix Frankfurt once called it a political thicket back in the one person, one vote cases. And so I think the Supreme Court of Virginia has been reluctant to enforce the meaning and language and thrust of that compact and contiguous line. They've been, this is my personal view, unduly deferential to the legislature. And I think the framers of the present Constitution would have been disappointed not to see that mandate fully carried out. So there are ways in which, if you could roll the clock back and give the revisors clairvoyance for the future, like to think they would have written the felon restoration provision and the reapportionment provisions differently from what they did.
Professor Howard, I know that people would be very interested in hearing from you how the Virginia Constitution is related to the Constitution of the United States.
You know, that's a wonderful question. I mean, now that gets to the heart of the matter. I mean, what is a state constitution? What's the purpose of it? What is its place? We are so blinded by the brilliance of the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal Constitution. Even lawyers don't think enough about state constitutions. When I was a law student at the University of Virginia, 3 years, I don't recall any of my professors talking about this state constitution. Now, maybe I skipped class or was sleeping that day. Maybe, maybe they did. I confess that I might have missed something, but I don't remember that they did. And when I worked with the commission and this process we're describing tonight, it opened up a whole world for me. I think what you have to understand, I have a sort of idiosyncratic notion that the federal Constitution is by design an incomplete document. It's not meant to tell the whole story because the framers at Philadelphia in 1787 understood that the state constitutions were already in place from 1776. For a whole decade, they'd been working documents. And so they were not meant to be replaced or superseded. So the federal constitution was in effect kind of a superstructure on the basis of those state constitutions. I think if you look at state constitutions, including Virginia's, you find that they articulate a way of life in a way that the federal constitution doesn't. They really, you can see them breathing the hopes and aspirations of the people of a particular state. The state constitutions, Virginia specifically, covers areas that go unmentioned in the federal constitution. Education, for example, that word's not in the federal constitution. The word environment doesn't appear. So when you think about how much government does over the centuries since Philadelphia, how much more government does since the days of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and 2 world wars and Civil War and all the rest, government reaches into more parts of life. State constitutions, by and large, are the ones that deal with that. And I think it's important to realize that if the people of a state choose to use their state constitution, if Virginians decide they would like to use Virginia's constitution to go beyond the federal constitution, they can't do less. Federal constitution is kind of a floor, but it's not a ceiling. They can use their state constitution to impose duties on the General Assembly, create rights for the people that don't exist in federal constitutional law. For example, the U.S. Supreme Court has rejected arguments that education is a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment. Well, we put it in Virginia. It is a fundamental right in Virginia in our own Bill of Rights. That we're perfectly free to do if we want to. So I argue that the Virginia Constitution is a vehicle for putting government more nearly in the hands of the people. People are in control of their own destiny because of the Virginia Constitution. So no one admires the federal Constitution and the Supreme Court more than I do. I clerk for Justice Black. I've seen the court from the inside. I have a lot of respect for them, but they don't have all the answers. And it's a good thing they don't. So I think the Virginia Constitution has to be understood as elaborating on the rights of the people and the uses of government well beyond the federal Constitution.
I might add one thing to that before we move from the unique parts of the Virginia Constitution versus the federal, and that is the State Corporation Commission, because of course the State Corporation Commission regulates all our utility bills. So we get one every month. We're touched by the work of the State Corporation Commission every month, indirectly, if not directly. And the State Corporation Commission is actually a constitutionally created body in Virginia. We sometimes refer to it as the fourth branch of government in Virginia. Whereas under the federal system, for example, the SEC is actually a statutorily created body. So that's one of the unique ways that the Virginia Constitution is very different than federal Constitution and many other state constitutions, actually.
Yes, I think there's a Public Utilities Commission in the Constitution of most American states, and the State Corporation Commission, you're dead right. It is in effect a fourth branch of government because it has legislative, executive, and judicial powers. Because the state constitution creates that. It was created during the age of populism, when people were mad because the legislators were in the pockets of railroads back in those days. State Corporation Commission tries to take it out of that, so the legislature can't go around chartering corporations for their friends and denying corporations to the people who are not their friends. So a lot of folks don't like what the State Corporation Commission does, but Justice McClanahan is absolutely right that it's there because it's in the state constitution.
Professor Howard, can you say a little bit more? We've mentioned other state constitutions, and I'm curious how Virginia's constitution compares with those of other states. And did you learn anything, did we borrow anything from other states in developing this constitution or the rewrite?
You'll forgive me, I'm a native Virginian. I was born and raised in this Commonwealth. I know we do things better than they do in other states. Now, I don't say that to my friends in other states because that'd be churlish on my part, wouldn't it? Be very impolite. But when we were in the process of writing the present Virginia Constitution, I went and talked to people in particular in New York and Maryland, where they had tried to rewrite their constitution and failed. I wanted to know what mistakes they had made. I was less concerned about borrowing what they had done and learning not to make the mistakes they had made. And we learned a lot from that process. I have to say, Virginia's constitution is not a perfect constitution. There's some things, if I were the czar and could just rewrite the constitution, I'd change some things. I've already mentioned voting rights and reapportionment. Law professors are the sort of philosopher kings of the modern age. We know we can do things very well, but aside, since I'm not, I can't do that. I will say, and this may sound immodest for a Virginian, that it really is, if it's not a perfect constitution, it's still better than most states have. Many states have tried to rewrite their antiquated constitutions. Alabama, for example, I've consulted down there, and they still have their 1901 Constitution, and I think they're unlikely to abandon that, even though it's a terrible constitution. Constitutions typically are too long, too detailed. They read like statute books. They're often still racist, and even if they can't make it work that way, they're still steeped in the wrong philosophy. So I would like to think other states could learn something from us if they cared to do that. I say, forgive me for the immodesty of that, but those of you who are born and raised in Virginia will understand that we are in the grip of self-esteem.
Well, I really thank you for that answer. And here we are in the 50th anniversary year of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so much is going on in the world. So much is going on in our country. I'm wondering if you think this might be an occasion for civic education.
Oh, absolutely. I think I've been investing some of my time in trying to encourage groups around universities and other groups to think about the Constitution at its 50th year. And one reason I do that is that this, again, I think about the difference between people's preoccupation with the federal Constitution of the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't deny the importance of that, of course, but people feel like that's at a distance. It's very difficult to amend the federal Constitution, and very few amendments. I mean, ask any proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. Back in the 70s, they thought that would go through fairly quickly, and it came to a halt. Maybe it will come to life again. We will find out in due course. But it seems very remote, and the Supreme Court seems a long way away. But the Virginia Constitution is closer. It's much easier to amend that Constitution. Typically, you go into the polls on election day, and there'll be an amendment or two on the ballot. So it's not easy to amend, but it can be done. It tends to evolve and change organically. Obviously, it's been now 50 years since it was overhauled completely, but there've been a number of amendments. So I think it's a constitution which is accessible enough and close enough to the people for some genuine debate, not just theoretical classroom debate, as important as that is, but debate over things that matter. I mean, proposals, for example, the bipartisan commission, part citizens, part legislators, that's now come into being to draw district lines, or proposals to do something about the access of former felons to the ballot. That's going through the political process. So the fact that you can actually lay your hands on the instruments of government in Virginia means that it should be an occasion for civic education. Now, beyond that, I mean, those are immediate, practical, political reasons, if you like. But I think beyond that, thinking about why we have a state constitution in Virginia, what it does, what its place in public life is a way of thinking about the same kind of issues that the framers talked about in 1787, which is to say, how do you put in place the machinery of government sufficient to satisfy the needs of the common good, and yet at the same time free up individual enterprise and individual rights and not trample on that. I mean, that's a difficult balance, but it's really an exercise in self-government by a free people, the sort of thing that James Madison, the university's namesake, was talking about. How do you understand the difference between a constitution and ordinary laws? Which things do you want to make more difficult to change? How do you want the machinery of government to work under that constitution? How do you reflect social change as you move from one generation to another? You look to the Virginia Constitution, you hope to reflect, as Thomas Jefferson put it, and James Madison in correspondence, they said the earth belongs always to the living generation. We respect what our ancestors did, we accept the legacy they've handed down to us, but ultimately the Constitution has to respond to the needs and the aspirations and the hopes of the present generation. So I would like to think that this 50th anniversary would be an occasion for discussions along those lines.
And speaking of that kind of civic education, Professor Howard, one more question from us before we turn it over to our students. And that is, I think a lot of our organizations have a role to play. Certainly colleges and universities, we believe we have a role to play in that civic education. That's why we're here tonight. But we all know Virginia is really steeped in history. And so one question is there a place for some other types of partners, you know, our history museums and cultural sites across the Commonwealth to be part of this? For example, places like Colonial Williamsburg, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, what role can they play as partners with some of the rest of us with our kind of civic education?
They absolutely have a role to play. When I was a kid growing, I've always loved history. It always has always. So when I was a kid, my family would take me to some of the great places like Mount Vernon or Monticello. Montpelier had not yet been developed then, Colonial Williamsburg, that sort of thing. And there was an air of hagiography. You were taken to the place to sort of admire some great man on a pedestal, you know, one of the founders, and you were told this, you should sort of bow and scrape before this historic figure. Okay, that was another day in time. And people don't go to historic houses today the way they used to. They've got bush gardens, and they've got all these other places. The kids want to go and go on the water slide. They don't care about admiring great men of a vanished generation. So I think that these institutions you've mentioned, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, Colonial Williamsburg, they're all the rest of them. I think they are in the process. They understand this, that they have to draw in families and children and the general population, not simply to admire some figure who lived in that great house, but to grapple with the great issues that we've been talking about tonight. And I think, take a place like Montpelier, as great as James Madison was, I'm not sure you could get people to go to Montpelier just to see the house that James Madison lived in. There are a lot of great houses. They're all over the place. So what they have to do is to engage people in thinking about the Constitution, constitutional heritage, of fundamental rights and the rest, in which James Madison obviously played a key part. So I think what they can do is humanize it by saying, look, a flesh and blood person like you back in those days, Madison, Jefferson, John Marshall, whoever, these people had to grapple with the same kind of questions you're dealing with in the context of their time. And here are the answers they came up with. What do you think? Those answers still working today or not? I mean, I'm sure I'm just singing a chorus here that I'm sure my friends at those houses are part of, but I'm sure they're looking for occasions to deal with these issues. And I would have thought the 50th anniversary was just such an opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for taking our questions. I really appreciate the answers that you've given and the enlightenment that you have delivered. Now to the most exciting part of our evening, the introduction of our students who will then ask questions. It's my pleasure to introduce you to James Madison University sophomore, Xavier Williams, who is a music education major and an honors college student. Xavier was recently elected as the student representative to the JMU Board of Visitors. Congratulations.
Wow.
Also, we have with us tonight, and I'm so proud to see him, Norfolk State University student leader, Malik Watkins, who is a junior political science major. Malik is currently the Virginia Young Democrats Public Affairs Director. Congratulations. And the Norfolk State University Young Democrats Political Action Advisor Director. I am so pleased that they will have the opportunity to ask further questions of Professor Howard.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Adams-Gaston, and to President Alger and all of the rest of the members that are here today. Thank you for allowing us to share in this moment. And I think we're all learning a little bit here today from your wise words of wisdom and unique experiences, Professor Howard. And we thank you for coming. And I definitely would say on behalf of all the students here at James Madison University, thank you for taking time out of your day to come and share with us tonight. I'll start off our question from the students tonight. And the first question I think is a great one because we always want to learn more about your perspective. And that question is going to be, if you had to make any changes or amendments to this Constitution, what would you do? What would that amendment, that change look like to the Constitution?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I love the student part of any program because they don't take any nonsense from a professor. Just because I have the word professor before my name doesn't prove anything. I have to prove it to you tonight, so I'll try to do that. I've sort of anticipated a couple of the things I would do myself, and there are changes I would make. There's no doubt about that. I would change the in the voting article. I would make it clear that as soon as a former felon had served his or her time and they were back in society, that their vote would be automatically restored. It would take no further action from the governor or from anybody. They would be that'd be automatic. Now, there's a cautionary tale here in that the voters of Florida approved an amendment to their state constitution along those lines, and then the legislators, thinking differently, added on to it in a way that has really, in good part, crippled that. So the changes I might make might not just happen overnight, but that's one I'd make. Secondly, I would put teeth in the reapportionment. I would probably go beyond the present structure. I would have preferred a reapportionment committee made up entirely of citizens. I would have said the legislators would have a hand in creating it, but they wouldn't serve on it. Now, I can't prove that that would work out better, but I'd be more comfortable. I will say that the present commission operates under rules of transparency, and that takes us a long way from the smoke-filled rooms that we're familiar with. I would put teeth in the environmental article. I mean, what issue is more daunting today than climate change and environmental degradation? And it's difficult to get the political forces to come to grips with that. So I would beef up Article 11 to make that mandate much more clear than I thought the present article pointed in that direction, but it has been interpreted not to have the teeth that I would put in it. I would like to do something with Dillon's rule, the one that says that localities only have those powers specifically granted them by law. I would reverse that presumption and say they have all powers not denied them by law. Some people feel differently about that, but I would trust local government. Again, it seems to be closer to the hands of local people. Education article is maybe the most difficult one because 50 years ago, the revisors were concerned, especially with desegregation, with getting massive resistance behind us and the like. I think that was done successfully. But increasingly, the central difficulty of education is really equity, of being sure that there are equal opportunities for students in rich districts, poor districts, students of all races and ethnicities. I mean, you're familiar, I mean, everybody follows these issues. What to have the Constitution to do about that is very daunting. I'm not an educator by training. I don't have the expertise, but I would like to bring together some experts to help think about, could the Constitution move us more nearly in the direction of educational equity? So I'm sure there are more issues, but I spend the whole night talking about them, but yes, there's some changes I'd make.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for having me. It's super excited to be up here with you, Professor Howard, President Adams-Gaston, President Alger, and other distinguished guests. Thank you for having me. So the question I will start off with is, should we consider undertaking a general revision like that which produced the 1971 Constitution?
Well, you know, I admit to a certain era of hypocrisy, which is to say the following. When I was going around the state campaigning for ratification of what's now the 1971 Constitution, I draped myself in the cloak of Thomas Jefferson, who famously, back in his day, said that each generation should rewrite the Constitution. And he defined a generation then as being 19 years based on mortality tables. So today, let's say people live longer, let's call it 30 years. Whatever the case, it has been more than that since the last rewriting. So if I were true to what I said 50 years ago, my answer ought to be yes. Right, it's time for a general revision. I have to tell you, my answer is no. And I mean, I'm not hesitant about that answer, whether it's consistent with what I was saying 50 years ago or not. I think the atmosphere in which the revision would take place today is manifestly different from what it was a generation or two ago. We have partisanship. We all follow how divided the country is. We have single interest politics. If you had a convention, all the single interest groups would be there. You pick a social issue: abortion, guns, single sex marriage, just whatever it was. People on both sides of that would insist on their provision being put in, or they'd be against the whole thing. A campaign for ratification would be a disaster, I think, because of social media, conspiracy theories, misinformation of a sort that we simply didn't have to deal with in 1970. I mean, maybe I don't mean to be a pessimist. I mean, I admire the question. It's a very important question. I wish my answer were yes, but I just think I just think the thing would, first place, I don't think it would happen. I don't think you could actually rewrite the Constitution. And if you did, I think that it would be a disaster. It's like the question, would I rewrite the federal Constitution? Well, it's not that we don't have 50 or 55 people just as smart as the ones who were at Philadelphia. The trouble is they would not be the ones who'd be in the room. This sounds terrible coming from someone who believes in the people, believes in democracy, believes in popular will. But I think trying to rewrite the Virginia Constitution by my lights would be difficult or impossible.
I think that was a really good response. And I think it kind of leads to the next question when we talk of a little bit about what people should expect of the Constitution. But I really think that question could be twofold in saying, what should people of Virginia expect from this Constitution, but also what are the limits they should expect from from the Constitution as well?
That's a wonderful question. We live in a kind of, I have traveled around the world and consulted with constitution makers in a number of countries, especially in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe. And I would say we are the most litigious people in the world. We're very rights oriented. We are quicker to seize upon some claim as being a matter of personal right. In this country, we're very good at taking an ordinary garden variety sort of dispute and turning it into a lawsuit and turning that into a constitutional claim. I sometimes think our national motto ought to be something like, I'll see you in court. Now, that being so, we place enormous demands on the federal Constitution and I think the state Constitution. We expect a lot of it. Now, I think we should expect it to be a fundamental document it's like steering a ship in the right direction. We should expect it to be a sound document that puts us on the right course. But the other part of your question is equally important. That is, what should we not expect of it? I mean, it can't provide the answers. If you start loading up the Constitution, take social issues. We had a marriage amendment in the Virginia Constitution. I thought it was a mistake to put it in there. Turns out the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision has constitutionalized same-sex marriage and therefore nullified the Virginia provision. Issues like that probably ought to be fought out on something other than putting an amendment in the state constitution. There's always a temptation, if you care about something, to put it in the state constitution. And that's why these state constitutions around the country are so overwhelmed and overborne and so detailed and complex. So people should be open, very clear-eyed about recognizing the limits of what you can do under a state constitution, because that invigorates the political process. I mean, constitutional government does depend in part on what the Constitution says, but it finally lies in the hands of the people. The people have to make it work or not. That's what civic education is about. So I think that's why I love your question, because it's part, what do we expect, but at the same time, what we should not expect.
So to follow up with that a little bit, you said that we shouldn't necessarily put everything that we care about in the Constitution. What is the alternative to doing so?
Well, if you don't put it in the Constitution, then of course you turn back to the political process, elections and the like. I mean, that's what representative government is about. I think, as you know, in some systems, you could have just direct democracy where everybody just gets in one great enormous arena and just votes on things. Greek city-states did that because they were small in population, but we obviously have to work through representatives. And I think that's why I'm so concerned about the need to clean up the political process, campaign finance, transparency in campaign donations. Virginia's laws in this respect are frankly very weak, among the weakest laws in the country. And we need to have a political electoral process that's clean and clear and transparent and honest, so that it yields results that actually reflect what people would like to see accomplished. So I think if you don't put all these issues in the Constitution, then you expect more of your political system of representative government. And I mean, I'm not saying it. I believe in American democracy. Again, I've been in other countries. I wouldn't trade our system for any other system I've seen. It's still better than the alternatives, but it could be better. And I think that's what your question implies.
Definitely want to echo your sentiments about election reform. Virginia's laws are pretty much lack thereof as it relates to elections, and we definitely have to change that. Which leads me, that also leads me into the next question. So we were talking about, these things that are putting in the Constitution, and Virginia has been very progressive, if you will, over the past 4 or so years to pass different legislation. For instance, just yesterday, marijuana will be legalized starting July 1. We've abolished the death penalty. What role do you think, or what impact does the recent passage of the Virginia Voting Rights Act have on the 1971 Constitution?
I think it's fundamentally important. I don't know that law inside out, and it covers, as you know, a lot of things, and maybe it could be fine-tuned with experience. We may decide to undertake some revisions. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it is definitely a move in the right direction. And I say that because a few years back in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Shelby County case, they reviewed the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and basically eviscerated it. I mean, they struck down the centerpiece of that act, that the provision which had been in place and had been reenacted by Congress several times. I thought the Supreme Court was off base in doing that. That Voting Rights Act from the 60s right on to the present time has been so important in curbing suppression of voting in states, in every state that's covered by the act. So after that 2013 opinion, what the court was basically doing was tossing the ball back to the states. And as you know, a number of states, I think, are moving in regressive directions with voter ID laws and cutting down on drop boxes and on, so many ways of making it more difficult, not only to vote in general, but especially more difficult for older people, for persons of color, people who don't live close to a polling place. I mean, they're practical. I hate to impugn the motives of people who pass these laws, but the effect or the impact to me is obvious, and it is not the right thing to do for American democracy. So I applaud the direction in which the Voting Rights Act of Virginia will take us. As I say, we'll see how the details work out in time, but it is, I said I was a native Virginian. I don't like all the things Virginia's done over the years, but I think they've done the right thing in passing this law.
Well, thank you. And we have a question that came in from YouTube, actually. And this individual said it's very interesting. The question that she's asking is very interesting. She didn't expect for it to be occurring during this time, but she said that it's interesting. There was an environmental provision back in 1971. She would love to know more about how that came about, and if you could share more information about that.
I'm sorry, what provision was that?
The environmental provision.
Oh, right. Thank you. Well, the environmental movement in this country really took off in the 1970s. The first Earth Day, there were federal statutes like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and a number of things. And I think it was at that time very bipartisan. I mean, those acts passed Congress overwhelmingly with the votes of both parties. So we were clearly on the right track. That progress has been more checkered in the time since that. And Virginia, I think, got on board at the right time. The idea was there were 1 or 2 legislators that took a particular interest in this, and they helped fashion the language. This was one of those difficult challenges of legislative drafting. You could have put into the Constitution, let's say, a requirement that every state agency in undertaking its particular responsibility would have to issue an environmental impact statement comparable to the federal statute, which required NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, which requires environmental impact statements. Now, those statements don't decide the merits of a project, but they do require a showing that the administrators in, let's say, building a road or whatever the project might be, took into account environmental consequences and upfront public comment, all that sort of thing. It would be very attractive to me to put that in the Constitution. But I thought at the time we were shaping that language that the Article 11 language went far enough because it clearly stated public policy. And the courts traditionally have enforced public policy. They accept that as if it's in the Constitution, it's the policy of Virginia. I think the courts could have told, in reviewing challenges to governmental projects, could have said, well, Article 11 is the basis for our saying to you, you've got to show us that you thought about the environmental consequences of what you were doing. If you can, it's sort of a process forcing kind of approach. And if you can show us that you legitimately took those consequences into account, it's not for us, the court, to decide whether to go forward with this project or not. But you just have to show us how you went about doing it. Now, I would have thought Article 11 was sufficient to require that. The courts of Virginia have decided differently. I respect their opinion, but they and I would disagree on that. But I think I loved having Article 11 because it showed that the revision of the Constitution was taking into account something that was really a rising major policy question in Virginia, throughout the country, and as now we know, globally. So in effect, we were a little bit ahead of the curve in 1971. There is no federal constitutional right to a quality environment. There were some cases brought in the 1970s. The court said, sorry, the federal Constitution doesn't say anything about the environment. So it left the ball in the hands of the states. And I think Virginia was one of the first states to pick up that challenge, as they did in 1971.
Thank you. So this question is also coming from the live audience. Trevor Cox asks, how did the commission perform its work? And the follow-up is, he knows that there is staff and a report. How did the distinguished commission members engage with the material and influence the final product?
Oh, that's interesting. Obviously there had to be a lot of staffing. Lewis Powell, Koga Dar, and the other members of the commission, as I mentioned earlier, were doing this sort of thing on weekends. They had jobs. They couldn't just take off from their law firm or whatever and go to work on the Constitution. They depended heavily, as these projects do, on a staff. We had 5 subcommittees, and each subcommittee had typically a fairly young law professor or lawyer helping them out as counsel. As I said, I was executive director, so I was working pretty much full time on it. I was impressed at each commission meeting with the seriousness of purpose of the members of the commission. As busy as they were, they would come. Lewis Powell, for example, here's a fellow, one of the leading corporation lawyers of his time, leader of the bar in the 1960s, president of the American Bar Association, later sat on the U.S. Supreme Court. He would come to the meeting. Aside from the court, of course, he knew his way around in the corporation article. He'd been practicing that stuff for years. But if it was one of the other articles like education or the franchise or whatever it might be, he came beautifully prepared, versed to engage in conversation. And I loved watching these people sit around the table and really come to agreement. Let me give you one example of a debate that I remember taking place that Lewis Powell suggested at one point. The country was in the grips of civil disobedience in the 1960s. There were a lot of uprisings, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And there was violence and arson, and cities were in flames. It was 1968, the year the commission started working, was also a year of great uprising and violence in American cities. So Lewis Powell suggested that there ought to be language about obeying the law, being responsible citizens and being law abiding and all that. And Oliver Hill, who was at the table, said, now, wait a minute, whatever you may think that means, folks that I deal with take this somewhat differently. They think that the law is not always on their side, that sometimes the law is abused. for persons of color in Virginia. So they worked together on compromise language, that Powell's language of obedience to the law was left in the draft, but coupled with suggestions from Oliver Hill that you have an obligation to respect the law in a society where due process of law is observed. So there was a kind of reciprocity there, and I thought it was a nice balance of two ideas at the hands of two individuals whose life experiences had really been quite different when you think about it. I mean, they came from different sides of the track in Richmond, and yet they understood how to come to a common purpose. So I just came away with so much admiration for people who could reason from whatever perspective it was, whether it was biracial, bipartisan, or whatever. So I think you had staff support, and then you had commissioners who really were serious of purpose about their job. And then I think they also, interestingly enough, they understood that they were not going to have the final word. They couldn't just write and promulgate the Constitution. Back in 1901, 1902, when those people wrote that Constitution, it never went to the ballot. They simply promulgated it. They were morally bound. They had it pledged before the convention to let the people vote on it. And they probably understandably, they decided, well, maybe people who are going to be disenfranchised might not vote yes. So they simply promulgated it. They just told the people of Virginia, here it is, you have a new constitution. Well, the commissioners in 1968, 1969 knew that was not going to be the end of it. The legislature and the people had to approve it. So they had with them, they carried with them to the table a nice sense, not only of what ought to happen, the right thing to do, but a sense of political limitations. I'll give you one example of that. Maryland, the year before our rewrite, they had a convention. They wrote a beautiful constitution, a model constitution, and they decided, among other things, that they would take the constitutional officers out of the Constitution and leave them to statute, leave them to the statute book, which is maybe a good idea. But when they did that, they created in every courthouse in Maryland a center of opposition against the proposed Constitution. And it went down to defeat. It only carried 2 counties in Maryland, Prince George's and Montgomery. It was defeated by margins of like 8-1 in some of the Eastern Shore counties of Maryland. Well, I went up to Maryland and talked to those folks, and I brought that lesson back to Virginia. And I said to my commissioners, I said, well, maybe you want to think about taking the commissioners out of the Virginia Constitution, but if you do that, take the sheriff and the commissioner of revenue and those folks and leave them to the statute, they're not going to be happy. And it'd be an academic gain, but a political loss. Well, the commissioners decided they would leave them in the Constitution. And when it came time for the referendum, not only had we not offended those groups of officers, each of the 5 associations of constitutional officers came out in favor of the Constitution. So that in the courthouses of Virginia, especially in the rural areas where those things mattered, they were advocates for the Constitution. So if I'd go down to Mecklenburg or Brunswick or Charlotte County in Southside and talk to folks down there, I always made sure to have some local official introduce me. I mean, how much credibility does a law professor for Charlottesville have in Mecklenburg and Brunswick County? Not very much, not out in the Appalachian part of Virginia either. But if you were sitting up there with Sheriff Joe Bob and he says, okay, Professor Howard may look like a pointy-headed intellectual to you, but he's okay. So those folks were on board. Now that's a political compromise. The price paid was not very great, but the gain was great. And to the credit of the commissioners, they understood those realities, and there were ideas like in the educational area. I think they would like to have had an even stronger, tougher, more enforceable education article than we have, but they realized at some point you'd reach a tipping point and couldn't do it. So good constitutional drafting, like law in general, requires a sense of the right balance between the perfect and the achievable. I think the commissioners, God bless them, they were people who, many of them had been in and out of public life. Some had served in the state Senate. 2 of the 11 commissioners had been governors of Virginia, Harrison and Darden. The others certainly had had a lot of concourse with politicians. So they understood the legislature would have to approve it, and then the people. And I think that's healthy. I don't think the commissioners ought to have had the last word. I'm glad they didn't.
Well, thank you so much for this wealth of information. I've truly learned a lot from this event. I didn't even know there was this constitutional difference, and the history of all of this is amazing. And do you have any final remarks before we turn it back over to President Adams-Gaston?
Golly, well, first I want to thank the universities who made this possible, and even more so to thank the students for taking part. I mean, my good, I don't know if you guys are thinking about law, the study of law someday, but I hope to see you in my classroom. And then when you speak up and you make some good point, I'll say, yeah, I remember him. He was on that program back in, in 2021. So I want to thank all of you. I mean, this is part of what I hope will be a larger conversation. I hope tonight will inspire other universities, other schools, other organizations to have programs. Doesn't have to be as beautifully organized as this, but any kind of conversation about the Constitution. Maybe you guys should go on the road yourself, Malik and Xavier. You know, maybe you ought to put it out that you're willing to be a speaker on constitutional government in Virginia. But I hope that people will take, and you don't have to be an expert. You know, it's not inside baseball or something like that. This is the people's Constitution. And I hope that students and teachers and government officials and other people around the state will really enter in this conversation that maybe will help to spread the word. So I've loved having a chance to take part in this. I mean, I confess I love teaching. I'd like to be in the classroom, but this is a chance to get out of my own classroom. My students have to be nice to me because I give them grades, right? I mean, how ugly can they be? But out on the road, it's different. People ask you what they're thinking about. I discovered that in the referendum campaign when I went into places I mentioned, places I'd never even couldn't have found on the map. And some of them didn't like what I had to say. They asked me very sharp questions. It made me think about the Constitution. So I hope this will be an ongoing conversation, which does not end in December 2021. I want this to be something that people think about, that it's not for a handful of judges and lawyers, it's for the people. So I guess that would be my final word.
And I'll make sure to contact you when I start applying to law school.
Yeah, we have a place for you in our classroom.
That sounds good.
Professor Howard, you definitely have inspired me, and I think you've probably inspired a lot of people with your wealth of knowledge, and I definitely want to thank you. And I definitely want to thank both presidents here at JMU, but also at NSU for the partnership of bringing this together and having these conversations. I think it is definitely something we need to continue to have. And I share that same hope with you, Professor Howard, that this does not need to be a conversation we just have tonight or that ends at the end of this year, but one that we need to continue to have. And so thank you so much for joining us. To Justice McClanahan, thank you so much for joining us as well. And to President Adams-Gaston and President Alger, thank you for allowing Malik and I to share in this event tonight, and really look forward to the partnership we will continue to have as JMU and NSU. Now over to President Adams-Gaston.
Well, thank you so much, Xavier and Malik. And wow, what an exhilarating evening this has been. Professor Howard, you are truly a phenomenal fountain of experience and knowledge and vision. And it has been my pleasure, and I'm sure everyone who's had an opportunity to hear you, a pleasure to really hear about something that is so important at this stage in our history of the Commonwealth, of the nation, and of the world. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the Task Force for the 50th anniversary of the 1971 rewriting of the Virginia Constitution, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight for this enlightening and educational discussion about an extremely important part of our history in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I would also like to thank my colleagues. and our moderator, Justice Elizabeth A. McClanahan, President and Dean of Appalachian School of Law. Additionally, I would be remiss if I did not thank our phenomenal student scholars, Mr. Xavier Williams of James Madison University and Mr. Malik Watkins of Norfolk State University, for your participation tonight. Both of you are clear evidence that our future is bright and that we are doing our part to shape the next generation of leaders in our communities. And the future is bright because of you. As President Alger mentioned previously in his opening remarks, this program represents a collaboration across higher education in Virginia. In the fall of this year, both of our institutions, along with other universities, will host events on their respective campuses that will address the unique aspect surrounding the rewriting of the 1971 Virginia Constitution. Moreover, we're working to plan a culminating event to recognize this momentous occasion and the hard work of all involved. And boy, was there a lot of work. Thank you, Professor Howard, for having us understand that. More information about these collaborations and events will be forthcoming. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the rewriting of Virginia's Constitution, we must also recognize other seminal events in our history, such as the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights legislation of the 1960s, which moved our leaders to rewrite the Virginia Constitution. Although we've seen much progress over the last 50 years, the fight for equality and justice rages on both here in Virginia and across our country. Access to the ballot and the ability for every citizen to exercise their right to vote continues to be threatened. COVID-19 has highlighted the stark health inequities that continue to persist in Virginia's communities of color. In short, there is still much work to be done before every citizen can realize the true promise of our democracy. Virginia's institutions of higher education are taking this charge seriously. The work that we are doing with the Council of Presidents Equity in Action Work Group, which I chair and President Alger serves on, is an indispensable part of the Commonwealth's ongoing commitment to equality. As universities, we must provide the avenue to educate our future leaders about the importance of history and their civic duty and responsibility to ensure that our Commonwealth will not only look forward, but continue to move forward. Again, on behalf of the task force, I would like to thank each of you for joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Good night, all.